Polishing the last of the silver took longer than it should have, because someone had left the fish knives in the wrong drawer again, and Eleanor Voss had spent 11 minutes she did not have locating them, arranging them in the correct order, and returning them to the sideboard before the footman arrived to set the long table for what her employer, Lady Ashford, had declared would be the most important dinner party of the season. The ballroom above Eleanor's head had been dressed for 3 days. She knew this because she had supervised the dressing of it. 400 candles in the chandelier arms, fresh garlands of hothouse white roses along every arch, the Ashford china pattern, the one with the blue hunting scene, laid at 22 places, each piece measured with a rule to ensure uniformity, because Lady Ashford believed that elegance was an argument one made with precision. Eleanor had made that argument on her employer's behalf every year for 6 years and had never once been thanked by name for it. She was not expecting to be thanked tonight either. She pressed one hand briefly against the cold paneling of the service corridor and went back to the fish knives. The guests arrived at 7. Eleanor heard them from the housekeeper's passage, the carriages, the greetings, the high particular laughter of women who had prepared for this evening since Thursday. She was not invited to observe the arrival hall. Her position at Ashford House existed in the spaces between rooms. She managed the accounts, negotiated with the tradespeople, organized the seasonal staff schedules, and was referred to in Lady Ashford's correspondence as my household administrator, a title that appeared on no official document and carried no wage increase since the 3rd year. She was, in the formal architecture of Ashford House, no one. What made this particular evening different from the 80 or 90 formal dinners Eleanor had administered over 6 years was a single name on the guest list, which she had copied into the household calendar herself 3 weeks prior: His Grace, Callum Ashford Wren, Duke of West Hollow. He was not Lady Ashford's husband. He was Lady Ashford's husband's eldest cousin, and he had not attended a social event of any consequence in 4 years. Eleanor knew this because she read the society papers with the same methodical attention she brought to the household accounts, not from personal interest in society, but because understanding who was connected to whom was an operational necessity when one was responsible for seating arrangements. The Duke of West Hollow had last appeared in print in connection with the settlement of his mother's estate, a proceeding that had been, according to the Gazette, managed with exceptional efficiency and no public comment whatsoever. She did not know what he looked like. She knew only that he was 34, that he had held the dukedom for 11 years, that his estate at West Hollow in Lincolnshire was considered both impressive and reclusive, and that 3 separate hostesses had attempted to arrange his introduction to suitable young women over the past decade with results the Gazette described as inconclusive. The fish knives were laid. The champagne was correctly cellared. The kitchen had confirmed the timing of the 2nd course. Eleanor returned to the housekeeper's room and went back to the estate accounts she had been working on since 5 o'clock that morning. She did not go upstairs to see the ballroom. There was no reason to. She had built it herself. And at the edge of all that candlelight and calculated elegance, bent over a ledger in a room 2 floors below with ink on her 3rd finger, was Eleanor Voss. She was 31 years old. She had been managing other people's lives with precision and without credit for 9 years. She wore a grey dress she had already worn twice that week and had not bothered to change, because no one in that dining room would look twice at the woman who had made it possible. The Duke of West Hollow came downstairs at 11 minutes past 7. Not to the housekeeper's room, he would not have known there was one. He came down because he had noticed, in passing through the entrance hall, that one of the candelabra on the lower landing had a candle burning at an angle that would drip wax onto the carpet runner within the hour, and he had intended to find a footman to address it. He found no footman. He found instead a door slightly ajar at the end of the service corridor, and through it, a woman bent over an open ledger with an expression of complete concentration, correcting a column of figures in a small, perfectly legible hand. He did not announce himself. He stood in the corridor for a moment and looked at her the way a man looks at something that has not yet declared what it is, not with desire, not with disapproval, but with the particular attention of someone who has just identified something that does not fit the pattern of the room. Then he went back upstairs and mentioned the candle to the senior footman. He did not mention the woman. But he thought about the ledger for the rest of the evening. Specifically, he thought about the fact that whoever was working in that room had been there before the guests arrived and would, he suspected, still be there after they left. And he thought about the column of figures, corrected with the steadiness of someone for whom this was not a task but a practice, the way a surgeon holds a tool, or a surveyor reads a line. He had not seen that quality in anyone in 4 years. The question of who she was stayed with him through the soup course and the fish course and the interminable third act of the conversation about hunting that Lord Fenwick seemed to believe was interesting. By the pudding, Callum Ashford Wren had decided he was going to find out. Eleanor Voss had grown up in Derbyshire, the daughter of a country solicitor who had taught her to read contracts before she could recite Bible verses, because he believed, with the practical affection of a man who had 3 daughters and no son, that a woman who could not understand what she was signing was a woman who would eventually sign something that ruined her. He died when Eleanor was 22, leaving behind a modest estate, 3 daughters, and a brother named Gerald who arrived from Manchester within the fortnight and declared himself the executor. Gerald Voss was not a dishonest man in the way that thieves are dishonest. He was dishonest in the way that comfortable men are dishonest. He arranged things to suit himself without quite admitting that he was doing so, and he genuinely believed his arrangements were reasonable. The arrangement he made was this: Eleanor, who had managed her father's household and assisted in the practice for 4 years, would continue to manage the household while Gerald reorganized the estate. Her younger sisters, 17 and 15, would remain in school until matches could be arranged. Gerald would take the income from the property and apply it to the estate's debts, which were, he explained, more substantial than Eleanor's father had disclosed. This was partially true. There were debts. But Eleanor had seen her father's accounts for 4 years and she knew the debts were not so substantial that they required the entire income from the Voss property to service. She said so, once, with great precision and a written accounting of the figures. Gerald looked at her over his spectacles and said that he appreciated her concern and that he would take her observations under advisement. He did not take them under advisement. He transferred the property income to his Manchester account and began receiving the estate rents. Eleanor did not break then. She came very close. There was an evening in November of that year, in the kitchen of her father's house with a cold cup of tea on the table and a letter from Gerald's solicitor in her hand, when she felt something in her chest that she recognized as the beginning of a decision to simply stop. To lie down, as it were, and let the machinery proceed. She pressed one hand flat on the kitchen table instead, and felt the grain of the wood under her fingers, and thought about her father teaching her to pass a lease agreement when she was 14 years old, pointing to each clause and saying this is what it means in practice, not in theory. She thought about what he had actually been teaching her. And she decided that she was not going to become less than she was for the convenience of a man who had never managed anything harder than a moderate-sized warehouse. She wrote 7 letters over the following 2 weeks, to 2 of her father's former clients who owed outstanding fees, to the wool merchant who had been overcharging the estate for 6 years. She had found the discrepancy in 1814 and her father had not known how to address it. She addressed it in 2 paragraphs, to the tenant of the East Field who had stopped paying rents and hoped the new executor would not notice, and to a family acquaintance in London named Mrs. Hartwell, who ran a respectable household and had mentioned, once, that she was in need of someone organized. The wool merchant paid within 3 weeks. The tenant resumed payment with an apology. Mrs. Hartwell wrote back within 10 days and offered a position. Eleanor took it. She informed Gerald, arranged her sister's situations to the best extent she could. The younger was nearly 16. Eleanor secured an agreement from Gerald in writing that her school fees would be maintained for 2 years, which he signed because she put it in front of him with a pen and a calm expression, and went to London with a trunk and the habit of rising at 5 in the morning. She worked for Mrs. Hartwell for 2 years, managing a household of 16 staff, 3 properties, and a complicated web of social obligations that Mrs. Hartwell pursued with the ambition of someone who had not yet achieved quite everything she wanted. Eleanor was competent and Mrs. Hartwell was pleased, which is not the same as being valued. When Mrs. Hartwell's niece needed a position, Eleanor was given a reference and 6 weeks' notice. The reference was good. Good enough to secure a position at Ashford House, where Lady Ashford needed, as she explained in the interview, someone who could take complete charge of the household operations because Lady Ashford herself was far too occupied with the social responsibilities of her position to attend to them personally. Eleanor took the position. She was 25. She understood immediately that what Lady Ashford needed was someone to operate the estate infrastructure invisibly, to manage the creditors, the staff schedules, the seasonal accounts, the tradesperson contracts, the event logistics, while Lady Ashford took the credit for the results in the form of a well-run house that impressed her guests. She was paid £60 annually. She managed operations that, by her private calculation, generated roughly £400 annually in recovered margin through better contract negotiation, reduced waste, and creditor terms she renegotiated in her first 18 months. She had never mentioned this calculation to Lady Ashford. There was no mechanism by which to mention it. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing, and the room, by long practice, sees no reason to look down. She had managed the Ashford house accounts for 6 years. She had been managing crises before breakfast for 9. She had not received a wage increase since the 3rd year, when Lady Ashford had raised her by £5 with the air of someone being exceptionally generous. She was, in all the ways that mattered to the machinery of her world, invisible. And she had learned, not without some cost, that invisible was not the same as unimportant, only that the two were frequently confused by the people who had never had to be either. She would be 32 in March. She had £6 in savings. She had a sister in Shropshire, now married, and a younger sister still in Derbyshire who wrote cheerful letters about her garden. She had not, in 9 years, allowed herself to want anything she could not arrange for herself. This was, she had found, the only reliable defence against wanting. Callum Ashford Wren, Duke of West Hollow, had the report on his desk by the following Tuesday. He had hired the same investigator he used for estate matters, a careful man named Price who worked in Chancery Lane and never put anything in a report that he had not personally verified. The report on Eleanor Voss ran to 4 pages. Callum read it once and then read it again, slowly, which was not his usual practice. What he had asked Price to find was simple: who was the woman in the housekeeper's room at Ashford House, and what was her actual function there? The report answered both questions with the specificity he had come to expect from Price, which was to say, thoroughly. Eleanor Catherine Voss, daughter of Thomas Voss, solicitor, deceased 1814. Currently employed as household administrator at Ashford House, Mayfair, at an annual wage of £65, though Price noted that the household accounts he had been able to review through a contact in the Ashford Tradespeople Network showed operational outcomes consistent with a manager of considerably higher competence and experience. 29 creditor agreements renegotiated in the first 3 years of tenure, of which 26 remained in the improved terms she had arranged. 3 seasonal contracts terminated for cause and replaced with suppliers offering better margin, each with documented justification in the household log. No formal complaints against her. No record of the kind Price had learned to look for in investigations of this nature. He also noted, in a single paragraph at the end, that Miss Voss was not listed on the Ashford Household Staff Directory that Lady Ashford had provided to the Household Register, the standard publication used by families in search of domestic staff. She was listed only in the internal household log, in Lady Ashford's own hand, as my administrator. Callum set the report on the desk and looked at it. His mother had been 31 when she ran the West Hollow estate accounts during his father's long illness, 11 years of careful management that had kept the estate solvent through 3 consecutive poor harvests and a disastrous investment his father had made before the illness made investing impossible. No one had credited her for it. He knew this because he had found her account books in the estate archive 8 months after her death, when he was clearing the study, and he had spent an afternoon reading them with the specific sensation of discovering something enormous that had been present all along. He had kept the books. They were in the second drawer of his desk at West Hollow. He was not given to sentiment. He had managed his grief in the way he managed everything, privately, thoroughly, and without troubling other people with its weight. He had come out the other side of 4 years of careful management of his own interior with a clarity about what he valued that he had not possessed before. He valued competence. He valued honesty. He valued the willingness to do hard work without performing it. He had not encountered all 3 in one person. Not since his mother. He did not tell himself that Eleanor Voss was like his mother. He was not the kind of man who confused categories. What he recognized in the report and in the memory of that ledger, that hand, that expression of concentration so complete it had made the rest of the room irrelevant, was a quality. A specific quality, not easily named, that had to do with continuing when there was no one watching. He needed, for reasons he had been avoiding for 4 years, to return to West Hollow. He needed, for reasons that were now becoming clear to him, to do so with someone who could manage what he could not manage alone. He sat for a long time at his desk. Then he went to call on Lady Ashford. He was civil, and he was brief. He explained that he was in need of a household administrator for West Hollow, that he had heard Lady Ashford's establishment was particularly well run, and that he wished to make an inquiry about the possibility of engaging her administrator, If such a person existed and if Lady Ashford were willing to recommend her. Lady Ashford was surprised. Then she was displeased. Then she was calculating. She said that her administrator was of course irreplaceable, but that if His Grace was particularly in need, she paused, weighing her options, she might consider the matter. Callum said he would appreciate the opportunity to speak with the person directly, if Lady Ashford consented, and that of course he would provide appropriate notice and compensation to ease the transition. He walked out of Ashford House an hour later, having arranged to return on Friday to meet Miss Voss in person, with Lady Ashford's reluctant agreement and the specific suspicion that he had just done something that Lady Ashford would not, on reflection, appreciate. He did not particularly mind. Eleanor received the message through Mrs. Park, the Ashford housekeeper, who found Eleanor in the linen room on Thursday afternoon checking the winter inventory. The message was that His Grace the Duke of West Hollow had requested a formal meeting with Eleanor Voss at 11 o'clock on Friday morning, with Lady Ashford's permission, regarding a potential household position at West Hollow Estate in Lincolnshire. Eleanor set down the linen count and looked at the wall for precisely 4 seconds. Then she picked up her list and continued. She thought about it properly that evening, sitting at the small desk in her room with a cup of tea and the habit of looking at things directly. The position at West Hollow was unknown. The Duke was unknown. The estate was large, she knew that much, and had been, by all accounts she had been able to locate in the society papers, operating in something less than full capacity since the previous Duchess's death 4 years prior. There would be, she calculated, a great deal of work. There might or might not be the conditions under which that work could be done properly. She would need to ask specific questions. She would need to understand what he actually wanted managed, and by whom, and under what terms. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. Friday arrived. She put on her best grey dress, which was only marginally different from her other grey dresses, but it was pressed, and went to the morning room at 11 o'clock and waited. The Duke of West Hollow arrived 3 minutes early. She noticed this. Early arrivals were in her experience either very eager or very controlled, and the man who entered the morning room did not look eager. He was tall, in a well-cut dark coat that carried its authority without ornament, and he moved through the room in the manner of someone completing a necessary procedure. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been attending things he would rather not attend for a long time and had become very good at not showing it. He looked at her directly. Not at the room, not at the arrangement of the furniture, at her. It was the first time in 6 years at Ashford House that anyone had entered a room and looked directly at her first. Miss Voss, he said. It was not a greeting. It was a confirmation of a fact. Your Grace, she said. Saturday. He placed, on the low table between them, a single sheet of paper, which Eleanor recognized as a summary document, not a formal offer, but a structured outline. I will be direct, he said. I am in need of someone to manage West Hollow. The full operational capacity of it, accounts, staff, tenant relations, seasonal contracts, and the particular problem of bringing a house that has been underused for 4 years back to a functional standard. I have read a summary of the work you have done here, and I believe you are capable of it. I want to know whether you are interested. Eleanor looked at the summary document. It was, in fact, a summary document, bullet points, clear structure, specific scope. He had prepared this. He had thought about what he was offering before he arrived. She asked 6 questions. He answered all 6 without deflection. The staff numbers, 14, with the expectation of expanding to 22, the current state of the estate accounts. He produced a 1-page summary she had not expected him to have to hand, the question of her formal title and wage, £45 per quarter, which was £90 more than she currently made annually, the question of her authority over hiring decisions, he said yes without qualification, the question of his own presence at the estate. He would be in residence most of the year, he had been absent too long and intended to correct it, and the question of the previous administrator's departure. There had not been one. The position had been filled by a series of temporary arrangements that had produced predictable results. She asked one more question, which was this: what do you expect of me that you have not written in this document? He looked at her with the particular stillness of a man who is being asked something precisely. Honesty, he said. When the accounts are wrong, I need to know immediately. When a decision I make is a poor one, I need to know before it becomes a problem rather than after. I have made the error of surrounding myself with people who agree with me, and it has cost this estate 4 years. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. I should tell you, she said, that I identified a £23 discrepancy in Lady Ashford's seasonal contract with the Covent Garden flower supplier in February of last year and reported it to her directly. She found it inconvenient. I would make the same report again. He said, good. They had been in the room for 22 minutes. She told him she would give him her answer by Monday. He nodded, retrieved his summary document, stood, and said, I should also tell you, Miss Voss, that when I located you the evening of the dinner party, you were correcting a column of figures. The error you had identified was in the wrong column, the sum was transposed, not incorrect. I noticed because I spent a year reviewing the accounts for an estate in this state and became familiar with that particular error type. Eleanor looked at him. You are correct, she said, and I caught the transposition when I checked the totals. I corrected it in the right column this morning. I know, he said. I confirmed it with the household log. He left. Eleanor sat in the morning room for 4 minutes after his carriage departed. She thought about honesty, and about someone who checked things in the household log before arriving to a meeting. She thought about a man who said 4 years in the way that people say things they have been accounting for privately, carrying the weight of it. She thought about £90 more than she currently made. She thought about West Hollow and what it would mean to walk into a house that had been let go for 4 years and put it back together properly. She sent her answer on Saturday, a day early, because she had made the decision Friday evening and saw no reason to wait. She arrived at West Hollow on the 3rd of October. The house, which she had anticipated would need work, needed considerably more work than the summary document had indicated. She stood in the entrance hall on the first morning with a notebook and went through every room methodically over 2 days, and what she found was not disaster but something very like its older, quieter cousin: 4 years of deferred maintenance, 3 staff members who had appointed themselves to roles they had not been hired for, a kitchen that had not been properly inspected since the previous winter, an estate ledger that had not been reconciled in 18 months, and a particular problem in the east wing involving a drainage fault that had been present, based on the stain pattern, for at least 2 years. 14 things. She wrote all 14 in order of urgency, with her preliminary estimate of cost and timeline for each. She brought the list to the Duke on the morning of her 3rd day, before breakfast, which she later understood was earlier than he had expected her to appear. He was in the study, already dressed. He rose early, she would come to understand, as a matter of long practice, and he looked at the list with the particular quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things. The drainage fault is the first priority, she said. It will worsen through November and cost considerably more to repair in the spring than it will now. I would like your authorization to engage a builder this week. You have it, he said. She was in the doorway. Miss Voss, he said, without looking up from the list. Have you eaten this morning? She had not. She had been in the east wing since 6 o'clock. I will do so shortly, she said. He looked up then. The kitchen will be in the breakfast room at 7:30. I would find it useful to continue this discussion there, if you are willing. She said she was willing. She had not been invited to a breakfast table in 6 years. It was not, she reminded herself, an invitation. It was an operational meeting. It was, she found, both. Mrs. Tully, the West Hollow housekeeper, was a compact woman in her 50s who had managed the domestic staff through 4 years of reduced capacity with something between stoicism and stubbornness, and who had been, by all evidence Eleanor gathered in the first week, the primary reason the house had not fallen further into disrepair than it had. She was also the first person in the household to extend Eleanor a specific welcome. She arrived at Eleanor's door on the second evening with a pot of good tea and a plate of shortbread and said, without ceremony, the staff are good people. They've had unclear instructions for a long time. They'll do better now. She left before Eleanor could thank her properly. Eleanor drank the tea and revised her staff assessment notes. There was also Mr. Barfield, Henry Barfield, the West Hollow estate solicitor, who arrived on the 9th day to discuss the outstanding lease agreements with the tenant farms. He was perhaps 60, careful, and had managed the West Hollow legal affairs for 20 years. He looked at Eleanor's preliminary account review with the expression of a man who has been waiting, without knowing it, for this review to happen. You found the Caldwell discrepancy, he said. This was a reference to an over-report in the Northfield rents that Eleanor had noted, with some puzzlement, as appearing to have continued for approximately 3 years. I did, she said. I identified it 18 months ago, he said, and was unable to determine who to report it to. You may report it to me, she said. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone recalibrating. I will do that, he said. He did not add, from now on. He did not need to. The opposition assembled in the third week, which Eleanor had expected. Lady Cecily Brant arrived first. She was the daughter of Viscount Brant of Nottinghamshire, 23 years old, possessed of a composure that had clearly been rehearsed from childhood, and she came with her mother and an aunt who were all three staying at the neighbouring Hatfield Park for the fortnight. The visit to West Hollow was a social call, announced by letter, and the letter's tone had the particular confidence of someone who considered the call a formality before an arrangement. Eleanor organised the visit because organising visits was her function. She had the drawing-room prepared, the tea appropriate, the household in order. She was not present for the visit itself, that was not her role, except that she was crossing the upper corridor with a set of revised tenant agreements when Lady Cecily and her mother came up the main stairs and encountered her. Lady Cecily looked at Eleanor the way one looks at furniture that has been placed in an inconvenient location. You are the administrator, she said, in a tone that made administrator sound like a slightly unfortunate fact. I am, Eleanor said. Lady Cecily's mother, who had the eyes of a woman who catalogued people for strategic purposes, looked at Eleanor with more attention. We understood the house had been in a rather poor state. You have managed an improvement. The drainage repair was completed last week, Eleanor said, and the east wing has been opened. We are approximately 4 weeks from having the house in full operational capacity. How efficient, Lady Cecily said. This was not a compliment. It was the sound of someone who had no interest in efficiency and considered it a quality that spoke poorly of those who required it. Eleanor said, I'll have the drawing room ready, Lady Cecily. The Duke is expecting you at 3. She moved past them and went to deliver the tenant agreements to Mr. Barfield's office and thought nothing more about it. What happened at 3 o'clock she did not witness. What she knew, from the particular sound of carriage wheels departing at 4:15 rather than 5:30 and from Mrs. Tully's expression at supper, was that the visit had not concluded as Lady Cecily had anticipated. The Duke came to find her that evening. She was in the library. She had discovered in the second week that the library had a serviceable writing table and that the Duke used the room before 8 in the mornings but rarely in the evenings, reviewing the tenant agreements Mr. Barfield had returned with annotations. She had a candle at her left elbow and the ledger open to the current year's rent column, and she was comparing it with her own projected figures. He appeared in the doorway without announcing himself. She had noticed he did not announce himself in rooms where he expected to find nothing, which suggested that her presence in the library at 9 in the evening was a surprise. She did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was on. Your Grace, she said. He came in and sat in the chair on the other side of the writing table. He did not, she noticed, sit at a distance. He sat where someone would sit who intended to look at whatever was in front of her. The Caldwell rents, he said, noting the ledger. Mr. Barfield's annotations have been useful. I believe the full discrepancy over 3 years is approximately £42. He looked at this with the expression that was becoming familiar, not surprise, not pleasure, but a specific kind of settled attention. I didn't know about the Caldwell situation. No, she said, without any particular inflection. You did not ask why I didn't know. It wasn't relevant to the correction, she said. The correction is what I'm focused on. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, there was wind coming in from the north. It was the 14th of October, and the autumn was settling into something serious. The candle moved slightly. Lady Cecily, he said, was given to understand that I might be considering a particular arrangement. Eleanor said nothing. I was not, he said. I want to be clear that I was not. It is not my affair, Your Grace, she said. Though she noted it. It is your affair insofar as it may produce social pressure on this household, he said, and you are the one who will manage the results of that pressure, so I am being precise. He paused. I find I am often more precise than is necessary. I find it useful, she said, which was true. He looked at her then, and there was something in it that was not the assessment she had grown accustomed to from him, not the ledger-reading attention, not the strategic consideration. It was something quieter and older, like a door that has been closed so long the wood has settled into the frame. She did not name it. She returned to the ledger. I'll have the corrected figures for you by Thursday, she said. He said good night and went. She sat for a while after he left with her hand pressed flat against the page of the ledger and the candle burning low, and thought that she had managed to work in a household for 3 weeks without once being made to feel that her presence was an imposition. She found this remarkable. She also found it something she was going to have to be careful about. Lord Aldrich Whitmore, the Duke of West Hollow's father's elder brother, arrived on the 26th of October. He was 62, titled in his own right as Earl Whitmore, and he occupied the specific position in the family hierarchy of a man who considered himself the authority on how things should be done because he had been alive long enough to have seen many things done badly. He arrived with 2 daughters, a son-in-law, and the clear intention of reviewing the state of West Hollow under its new management. He was not unkind to Eleanor when they were introduced. He was not unkind in the way that a man is not unkind who does not see the point of being kind to persons of no particular standing. He looked through her, precisely, and addressed all household questions to Mrs. Tully. Mrs. Tully redirected every question to Eleanor without comment. Eleanor answered each question with specific figures and did not take offense at being looked through, because she had been looked through for 9 years and had developed, if not exactly immunity, then at least a functional armor that had stopped rusting. The actual difficulty came at supper on the 3rd evening of the visit, when Lord Whitmore raised the question of the West Hollow Estate's operational strategy in a way that made it clear he had opinions he had been assembling for some time. "My nephew," he said, he addressed the Duke directly, as though the other people at the table were furniture, has, I understand, made a series of changes to the estate management structure. I have reviewed the preliminary reports and I have some concerns. Please raise them, the Duke said. The engagement of an administrator at this level of authority is unusual, Lord Whitmore said. Particularly an administrator without formal credentials. Miss Voss's credentials are her results, the Duke said. Which are documented. Lord Whitmore's eyes moved briefly to Eleanor, and she saw in them the thing she always saw in men of his type, not malice, but the considered belief that she was a disruption to something structural, something that had worked by a particular logic for a long time and did not need this kind of amendment. He was not wrong about the logic. He was wrong about whether the logic should continue. I am certain she is competent, Lord Whitmore said. He meant the sentence to close the discussion. Eleanor said, if it would be useful, my lord, I can provide the full account reconciliation for the last 6 weeks, with comparatives against the previous year. It might address the specific concerns more efficiently than a general discussion. Lord Whitmore looked at her. She had spoken evenly, without any particular emphasis, and was looking at him with the direct attention of someone who has offered a practical solution and is waiting to see if it will be accepted. That would be, he said, after a pause, useful. She brought the accounts the following morning. She brought them in person, to the study where Lord Whitmore had positioned himself, and she walked through the figures with him for 40 minutes, column by column, including the Caldwell correction, the drainage repair cost and projected savings against deferred repair, and the revised tenant lease structure that Mr. Barfield had formalized with her input. Lord Whitmore asked 6 questions. She answered all 6 without deflection. At the end of 40 minutes, he said, the Caldwell situation should have been caught before. Yes, she said. By the previous arrangement. Yes, she said. He did not say anything more about credentials, or about what kind of administrator was suitable. He left the following morning, and he shook Eleanor's hand before departing, which he had not done on arrival. She returned the handshake without expression and went back to the accounts. That evening, the Duke found her in the library again. He did not sit across from her this time. He sat in the chair to her left, which was closer, and which was the chair that the candle illuminated rather than the chair that faced the window, and he said, my uncle spoke to me before he left. Did he? She said. He said, and I am quoting precisely, she is more organized than I expected. He paused. From Whitmore, this constitutes an endorsement. Eleanor looked up at him. There was something in his face that was not quite amusement, it was lighter than that, quieter, a thing she had seen occasionally in the last 3 weeks and had not found a precise category for. I'll put it in the accounts as a credit, she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It surprised her, and she suspected it surprised him. The music was an accident. Eleanor had not intended to be discovered at the piano. She had thought it was empty in the evenings because she had spent 3 evenings there and encountered no one. The music room was at the south end of the ground floor, off the library corridor, and it contained a pianoforte that had been kept in tune. Someone had seen to that, at least, despite everything else that had lapsed. She played because she had played since she was 12 and because it was the one thing she did in the evenings that had no productive purpose, which meant it was the only thing she did that was entirely her own. She had been playing for 40 minutes, working through a sonata she had played since her father's house, and then, on an impulse she did not quite examine, a piece she had found in the estate music collection, handwritten on slightly yellowed paper and marked in the margin with the letter M, when she became aware of someone in the doorway. She finished the phrase. Then she stopped. "I apologize," she said, turning. "I did not realize the room was needed." The Duke was standing in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, without his coat, which was the first time she had seen him without it, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the ledger-reading attention. Something that had gone past that, like a note played that makes you realize the whole piece has been building toward it. "That piece," he said. "It was in the collection," she said. "I should have asked before. My mother wrote it," he said. Eleanor went still. "She played it in the evenings," he said. "In this room. I haven't heard it since she died." He said this without apparent difficulty, in the tone of someone reporting a fact they have spent 4 years learning to report simply. Eleanor understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had sat in a kitchen in November with a cold cup of tea and learned what it cost to hold something, exactly what it had cost him to say that sentence simply. "I'm sorry," she said. And then, because she was not a woman who softened things beyond their true shape, she was a very good composer. He stood for a moment longer. Then he came in and sat in the chair beside the piano that was not the performance seat but the listener's chair, the chair placed slightly to the side and behind, and he said, "Would you continue?" She continued. She played the rest of the piece to its end, and then she played 2 others from the collection, and when she finished the room was very quiet and the fire had burned low. "Her name was Margaret," he said. He was looking at the fire. "She ran this estate for 11 years during my father's illness. She kept it solvent through 3 poor harvests. I found her account books after she died. No one had mentioned them. Not her solicitor, not the estate staff, not my father." Eleanor pressed one hand briefly against the piano's lid. "The books are in your desk," she said. It was not a question. She had seen the second drawer, which he opened and closed with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered. He looked at her. "Yes. She did good work," Eleanor said. "She did extraordinary work," he said, and his voice had in it something that was neither grief nor pride but some compound of the two, like armor that has been repaired so many times the original metal and the repair have become a single structure. He looked at her in the firelight with the expression she had been keeping careful watch on for 3 weeks, and she thought, "This is the moment where I need to be very clear-eyed." "You hired me," she said, "because she would have been good at this." He was quiet for a moment. "Partly," he said. "The other part is that I hired you because you are good at this. They are not the same thing." She thought about that. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. "Good night, Miss Voss," he said. He did not move from the chair. She found, when she reached the door, that she wanted to look back. She did not. She went to her room and sat at her desk and looked at the wall for a long time, thinking about the difference between being hired for what someone represents and being seen for what one actually is, and finding that she could not quite determine, with the reliable precision she applied to most things, which of the two was happening, or whether the distinction could hold at this distance. She picked up her account notes and returned to the figures. She had been managing complications before breakfast for 9 years. She could manage this. It was Miss Dorothea Lang who wrote the letter. Eleanor learned of it from Mrs. Tully, who had heard of it from the senior footman, who had, in the particular information economy of a large household, learned of it from one of the undermaids who was walking out with a groom from the neighbouring Hatfield Park, which was still, for weeks into November, hosting Lady Cecily Brant and her family. The letter had gone to Lord Whitmore. It said, and Mrs. Tully, who was not a woman who embellished, was precise about this, that the current administrator at West Hollow was widely understood among the families of the county to have formed an inappropriate attachment to the Duke, that her presence in the household constituted a social irregularity that reflected poorly on the Duke's judgment, and that the matter ought to be addressed before it became a more serious reputational concern. Miss Dorothea Lang was Lady Cecily's aunt. Eleanor knew this from the guest records. She also knew, from the same records, that Miss Lang had made 3 previous social calls to West Hollow over the past decade, 2 of which were listed in the household log as calls to the previous Duchess, the Duke's mother, who had apparently known her. Eleanor sat with this information for approximately 2 hours. Then she did 3 things. The first was to write a complete financial summary of her 6 weeks at West Hollow: accounts reconciled, repairs completed, staff positions formalized, lease agreements updated, cost savings documented. The summary was 11 pages and included comparative figures against the 18 months prior to her arrival. She wrote it in the clear, specific hand she had been using since her father taught her that a document was only as useful as it was legible. The second was to locate, in the estate archive, the West Hollow household staff records for the previous 8 years, which she had been organizing since the second week as part of the general administrative recovery. She cross-referenced these records against the Hatfield Park visitor logs, which had been kept in a secondary volume in the archive and which showed, with complete transparency, that Miss Dorothea Lang's most recent visit to West Hollow had been in June of the previous year, 3 months before Eleanor arrived, and had lasted 4 days. There was nothing irregular in any of this, except that the June visit had coincided with a period in which the Duke had been absent from the estate, which the household log confirmed. Eleanor noted this without conclusion. She was not building a case. She was understanding what she was dealing with. The third thing she did was to go and straighten the Duke's cravat. This is not quite accurate. What happened was that she encountered him in the entrance hall at 7 o'clock in the morning, preparing to ride out to the North Fields with Mr. Barfield, and she noticed, as she had been noticing for 4 days, that his cravat had been tied in a fashion that produced a slight asymmetry on the left side, which had worsened today to the point of being visibly incorrect. She stopped in front of him and said, "Your cravat has been slightly wrong for 4 days. May I correct it?" He looked at her. "I was not aware of it. I have been deciding whether to mention it," she said. This was true. She had been deciding, and what she had been deciding was whether she was permitted to want to correct it, which was a different question from whether she was able to. "Please," he said. She reached up and adjusted the fold, setting it correctly, her fingers working with the neat efficiency of someone who had managed 14 things in the last 3 weeks and was accustomed to making corrections. She was very close to him. He stood completely still. "There," she said, and stepped back. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one that had moved past the ledger-reading attention and into something older and quieter. "Miss Voss," he said. "I have received a letter from my uncle this morning that I think we should discuss." She said, "I know about the letter. I have prepared a document that I think will address it." He blinked. This was the first time she had seen him blink with surprise. "Naturally," he said. It was the first time she had heard something that was unambiguously warm in his voice. They went to the study. She gave him the 11-page summary. He read it with the full attention he gave to things that mattered, which was all his attention, and when he reached the 11th page he set it on the desk and looked at her and said, "This is not the document of a woman who has formed an inappropriate attachment." "No," she said. "It is the document of a woman who has done her job. I intend to send a copy to my uncle," he said. "I think that is correct," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "There is something else I should say." She waited. "I am aware," he said, "that I have placed you in an irregular situation by engaging you in this role. I was aware of it when I engaged you, and I am more aware of it now." He paused. "I have not been careless about it. I want you to know that." Eleanor looked at him with the particular stillness of a woman who has spent 9 years being precise about things that mattered. "I know," she said. "You have been, in fact, exceptionally careful." He said nothing. He simply looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them named what they were looking at. She went to the door. "The cravat," she said, without turning. "Yes. It was wrong for 40 minutes before I mentioned it." She paused. "In future I will say something sooner." She went out. She heard him behind her, not following, but the sound of a chair moving, the sound of someone sitting with something they have not yet decided how to hold. She had been managing this particular complication for 6 weeks. She could continue to manage it. What she was less certain of was whether she wanted to. The formal inquiry was called by Lord Whitmore for the 15th of November, and it was not, technically, a legal proceeding. It was a family council. The West Hollow estate was entailed in a manner that gave the senior family members consultative rights on what Lord Whitmore termed structural decisions, and it was held in the estate's principal drawing room, which Eleanor had spent the previous 2 weeks restoring to full operational condition, including the repair of a ceiling plaster detail that had been failing since last winter. Lord Whitmore arrived the day before with his son-in-law, his solicitor, and a family friend named Sir Edmund Peel, who had been, according to the family records, a trustee of the estate during the period following the previous Duke's death. Lady Cecily Brant also arrived. This was not part of the official council, but it was not unexpected. Eleanor received all of them with the procedure of a household that was now running at full capacity. The rooms were ready. The staff was in order. The meals were properly arranged. She had also, the previous evening, organized every document she possessed into a single-bound portfolio: the 11-page summary, the comparative accounts, the Caldwell correction, the lease agreements, the drainage repair cost and savings analysis, the staff formal structure, the creditor contracts renegotiated, and she had set this portfolio on the writing table in her room and looked at it with the calm of someone who has done all the work and knows it. The council convened at 10 o'clock. Eleanor was not invited to be present. She had not expected to be. What happened was that the Duke invited her anyway. He came to her room at 9:50, which meant he had left the drawing room to come and find her, which meant the council had likely already begun to assemble, and he stood in her doorway in his full formal coat. He was dressed with the careful precision of someone who understood that clothing, like everything else, made an argument, and he said, "I would like you to present your accounts to the council." "I'm not a member of the family," she said. "You are the person who can answer their questions," he said. "Which is the relevant qualification." She looked at him. "You understand this is irregular. Everything about this situation is irregular," he said. "I find I mind it less than I expected to." Eleanor picked up the portfolio. The drawing room went very quiet when she entered. There were 7 people seated or standing: Lord Whitmore at the head of the long table, his son-in-law to the right, Sir Edmund Peel and his solicitor to the left, 2 senior family members she recognized from the household records and had not yet met, and Lady Cecily Brant in a chair to the side of the room, not at the table, which meant she was an observer and not a council member, though her expression suggested she had not fully accepted this distinction. Eleanor set the portfolio on the table. She stood at the end of it, facing Lord Whitmore. "My lord," she said, "I understand the council has concerns about the current management structure at West Hollow. I have prepared a complete accounting of the work completed in the 6 weeks since my engagement. I would like to present it, if the council is willing." Lord Whitmore looked at the Duke, who had taken his seat at the other end of the table. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Please proceed, Miss Voss." She presented for 40 minutes. She did not argue. She did not plead. She presented figures, timelines, documented outcomes, comparative data. She walked through the 11-page summary with the precision of someone who has organized it for this purpose, which she had. She addressed the drainage repair and its 3-year cost projection. She addressed the Caldwell correction and the revenue recovered. She addressed the lease restructuring and Mr. Barfield's documentation. She addressed the staff formalization, by name, by role, with wage rates and the specific responsibilities now attached to each position. She addressed the creditor contracts she had renegotiated, 3 of which had been outstanding for over 2 years. When she reached the final page of the summary, the operating margin projection for the coming year against the prior year's actuals, she set the portfolio flat on the table and looked at Lord Whitmore and said, "I recognize that my engagement is structurally unusual. I am asking the council to evaluate it against its results rather than its form." There was a long, suspended moment. Sir Edmund Peel looked at the figure on the final page of the summary. He looked at it for some time. Then he said, "The projected margin recovery over 12 months is this figure here?" "Yes," she said. "Based on the first 6 weeks as a baseline. Against what the estate produced last year?" "Yes. I have the previous year's accounts in the appendix, if you would like to compare." He looked at the appendix. He looked at Lord Whitmore. He did not say anything. Lord Whitmore, who had listened to all 40 minutes with the expression of a man who is reassembling something he thought he understood, said, "You identified the Caldwell discrepancy in your first week." "In my first 3 days," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was not warmth and was not contempt, it was something older and more honest, the expression of a man who has realized he measured something incorrectly and is deciding what to do with the measurement. "Mr. Barfield knew of it," he said. "Yes. He had no clear authority to report it. He now does." Lord Whitmore turned to the Duke. "Callum," he said, the first time Eleanor had heard him use the name, "she is a great deal more thorough than you described." "I described her accurately," the Duke said. She is more thorough than any description manages. The room had changed. Eleanor felt it before anyone named it. Sir Edmund Peel was still looking at the margin projection. The two senior family members were looking at each other in the way of people who have just recalibrated. Lord Whitmore was looking at the portfolio. Lady Cecily, in her chair to the side, was looking at nothing with great composure. Eleanor had not looked at Lady Cecily once during the presentation. She had looked at the council, and at the documents, and at the specific questions each person was actually asking underneath the questions they said aloud. The Duke stood. He moved to the end of the table where Eleanor was standing, and he stood beside her, and he looked at Lord Whitmore and said, "I want to make clear that I intend to request Miss Voss's continued engagement at West Hollow, and I want to make clear in this room that my reasons are both professional and personal, and that I intend to address the second category in the appropriate form as soon as the council has satisfied its questions." Lord Whitmore looked at him. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he did something she had not anticipated. He stood up from his chair and walked to the end of the table, and he extended his hand to Eleanor, and he said, "Miss Voss, I owe you, I believe, an acknowledgement that I was looking at the wrong evidence when I looked at this situation." Eleanor shook his hand. She looked at him steadily. "Thank you, my lord," she said. He returned to his seat. He said to the room, "I have no further objections." The Duke, beside Eleanor, took her hand, her bare right hand, because she had removed her gloves to handle the documents and held it properly, not the brief professional handshake but the full deliberate hold, and then he raised it and kissed her knuckles, which is the gesture of a man who is making an argument not for himself but for the person whose hand he is holding. The room saw this. Everyone in the room saw it. That was the point. Eleanor stood completely still through it and kept her eyes forward and thought about her father at his desk in Derbyshire with a contract spread before him, saying this is what it means in practice. She thought about a kitchen in November and a hand flat on a table. She thought about a cold cup of tea and a decision she had made about who she was going to be. She thought, I have been waiting a long time for a room to see this. Lady Cecily rose from her chair, gathered her composure with the efficiency of someone who has been preparing for a graceful exit, and left the drawing room. The door did not close loudly. There was nothing in the departure that anyone could have called a scene. Eleanor thought, she will be quite all right. She is young and she is contained. The world is arranged more thoroughly in her favor than it has ever been arranged in mine. She will find something better than this. The council was concluded by noon. Lord Whitmore and Sir Edmund Peel departed the following morning, and Lord Whitmore shook Eleanor's hand again at the door with more warmth than the first time and less formality, which she thought was the most genuine form the gesture had yet taken. The house went quiet. Eleanor was in the library that evening. It was the 22nd of November, a Thursday, and there was frost on the windows for the first time when the Duke came in and sat in the chair to her left without any preliminary arrangement, the way a person sits when they have decided to do something and the deciding is already finished. She set down her pen. "I have considered," he said, "what I want to say to you and have concluded that I am going to say it simply, which is the only way I am capable of saying things of this kind." "I know," she said. "You have been precise about everything." "Yes." He looked at her. "I made a public statement this morning that requires a private one to support it. I want to make it now." He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but placing the words the way someone places a very good tool on a bench before using it. "I notice everything you do," he said. "I notice when you have been in the East Wing since 6 in the morning and haven't eaten. I notice when you correct a thing 3 days before you mention it, and the reason you wait 3 days is that you are deciding whether you are allowed to want to correct it." He paused. "I notice the way you play. I notice that you stayed in this house because you were not going to become less than you were, which is the same reason my mother stayed in this house, and it is not the same thing as what you and I are, because you are not my mother and I am not comparing you to her. I am saying that I recognize the quality, and I recognize you, and I am not going to not say so because it falls outside the expected form." Eleanor looked at him. She felt, in her chest, something very specific that she was going to have to sit with carefully before she could name it. "I should tell you," she said, "that I have been exceedingly careful for 6 weeks about not wanting anything I couldn't arrange for myself." "I know," he said. "You have been very precise about it." She looked at the fire. "I would need," she said, "to know that this is not about what I represent. About your mother, or the idea of her." "It is not," he said. "I have thought about that specifically. You are not a continuation of something. You are a person, and I should like, if you are willing, to know more of what you are. She looked at him. She thought about it completely, the estate, the work, the council, the music room, the study at 7 in the morning with the coffee growing cold between them. She thought about the second drawer of his desk and what it contained and what it told her about the kind of man who kept things rather than discarding them. She thought about what it meant to be offered the thing you had stopped counting on, by someone who had done his research before arriving. Yes, she said. I am willing. It was the most considered acceptance she had ever given. He did not reach for her immediately. He sat for a moment with the word, the way he sat with things he valued. Then he said, I'm glad, and it was the simplest sentence she had heard him produce, and the truest. They were married in January, at the church in West Hollow Village, in the first real snow of the year. The ceremony was quiet. Lord Whitmore attended, unexpectedly, with one of his daughters, and Mr. Barfield served as the estate's witness, and Mrs. Tully sat in the front pew and did not permit herself to weep, which required some effort. Eleanor's younger sister, Anne, came from Derbyshire and embraced her with the particular warmth of someone who had been hoping for a long time, at a careful distance, and was now permitted to show it. She said, You look exactly the same, and Eleanor said, I am exactly the same, and Anne said, Yes, that is what I mean, and they stood for a moment in the cold porch of the church before going in, and Eleanor was glad for the cold because it gave her a reason to press her hands hard against her sides and compose herself. The Duke, her husband, which remained for some time a phrase that required deliberate internal repetition, was standing at the front of the church when she came in a dark coat that was, she noted, slightly different from his usual one. More formal. He had chosen it carefully. His cravat was correct. She had checked. The vows were made. She made hers in the same even register she brought to everything, and she meant each one with the specific, considered weight of a woman who has learned that words are only useful insofar as they are accurate. He looked at her when he made his with the ledger-reading attention, and something that had moved so far past it there was no useful comparison to be made. West Hollow in the months that followed became what Eleanor had projected it could become, a house in full operational order, a staff of 22 working within clearly defined structures, a set of tenant lease agreements that Barfield had formally documented and that had begun to attract favorable comment from neighboring estates whose solicitors were beginning to make inquiries. The drainage fault held. The east wing opened completely by spring. The account books balanced to the penny every quarter. She and Callum established, without ever formally discussing it, a division of labour in which the decisions of the estate belonged to both of them and the documents were primarily hers and the early morning rides were primarily his and breakfast was always together. They argued, occasionally, with the precise and unbothered quality of two people who are both accustomed to being right and have learned to tell the difference between correct positions and entrenched ones. He came to find her in the library most evenings. She played the piano on the evenings when she did not fall asleep over the ledger first. He sat in the listener's chair and sometimes read and sometimes simply sat, and she found that the habit of being watched by someone who had looked for you specifically was one of the more reliable forms of warmth she had encountered. She began to keep a set of annotated accounts, not just West Hollow's accounts, but a structured document on household management principles, with specific examples from the last 2 years, in the form of a practical guide that could be replicated. Mr. Barfield helped her organize it into a legal and financial structure. Henry Whitmore, Lord Whitmore's son-in-law, who had been present at the November Council and had turned out to be considerably more thoughtful than his association with Lord Whitmore had initially suggested, expressed interest on behalf of 2 neighbouring estates who were looking for a framework for lease reform. By the end of the first year of the marriage, copies of Eleanor's management guide had been distributed to 5 estates. By the end of the second year, there were 14, and a solicitor in Lincoln had asked whether she would consider formalizing the system into a published document for wider distribution. She discussed this with Callum in the library, in the spring of the second year, with the window open and the smell of the gardens coming in. He listened to the full proposal and then said, "Do it," without any qualification, because he had been doing this, saying yes to her work without qualification, since November, and she had stopped being surprised by it and had simply come to understand it as a fact of her life, as reliable as the east wing drainage. Their daughter arrived in September of the second year. She was named Margaret, which was Callum's suggestion and Eleanor's immediate agreement, and she had Callum's quality of complete stillness and Eleanor's capacity for precise focus, which in a very small person produced an effect that was both delightful and occasionally overwhelming. Eleanor's annotated management guide, formerly published by a Lincoln solicitor in the third year of the marriage under the title A Practical System for Estate Household Management with Comparative Accounts, carried her full name on the cover, Eleanor Ashford Wren, née Voss. It was eventually adopted by 22 estates across 3 counties, and a significant portion of it was incorporated into a broader guide on tenant lease reform that Barfield and his colleagues produced 3 years after that. It was not the thing she had planned. She had not, in Ashford House's housekeeper's room in the middle of 6 years of invisibility, planned for this. She had planned to survive, and she had, and the rest had followed from that in the specific way that good work followed from good work if the conditions ever became right. One evening in the third year of their marriage, Margaret was walking by then, with the determined urgency of someone who has places to be. Though the places were unclear, Eleanor was at the writing table in the library when she heard the small rapid footsteps in the corridor that indicated Margaret had escaped from the nursery again. She put down her pen and waited. The footsteps stopped at the library door. There was a sound of concentrated effort, and then the door swung inward and Margaret appeared, in her nightdress, with a decisive expression. Eleanor looked at her. "You are supposed to be asleep." Margaret sat down on the hearthrug with the air of someone who had heard this before and found it unconvincing. Eleanor became aware that Callum had appeared in the doorway behind Margaret. He must have heard her in the corridor and followed at a careful distance, and was standing there in his shirt sleeves, without his coat, watching the scene with the exact expression that she had learned, in 3 years, to trust. The full specific attention of someone who has looked for something and found it. She looked at him looking at her. She picked up her pen. "She has your sense of argument," she said. "She has yours," he said. "Mine is quieter." He came in and sat in the chair beside her, and Margaret, on the hearthrug, selected a volume from the lower shelf with great seriousness and opened it, upside down, and appeared to consider it satisfactory. Outside, the West Hollow grounds were dark and cold and well in order, the drainage sound, the east wing lit, the accounts reconciled, the leases filed, the staff sleeping in rooms that had proper assignments. Somewhere in Lincoln, a solicitor was arranging the second printing of a practical guide that bore her name on the cover. Eleanor Voss had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work. The world had simply finally agreed to look. Callum's hand rested on the table beside hers, and she turned her own hand over without ceremony, the way one does a thing that no longer requires deciding, and his fingers closed around hers, and they sat together in the warm library while their daughter turned the pages of an upside-down book, and the night pressed quietly against the windows, and the fire held.